This is a summary of the civil rights movement, and this is the first summary which looks at the background to race relations in America. To understand what happens in the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s, you have to understand what kind of country America is, how it developed, and in particular how black people's experiences in America developed. America is a federal country, which means it is a union of 50 states. Each state is separate. Each state has its own flag, has its own culture, has its own tradition, and has the right to set its own laws. America is also a country based on immigration. The majority of American citizens are themselves immigrants or descended from immigrants. In almost all cases, these are people who chose to go to America. They went there looking for a new life, for a new adventure, many of them going believing that they would get rich. The one ethnic group whose experience of going to America is different is the black population, the African American population. They are descended from slaves. They didn't go to America because they wanted to, they went because they had to. And to understand why America needed slaves, you have to look at the very beginnings of America. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when America was being developed by largely European settlers, they were going there to make money. They were moving to America to set up new plantations, new businesses aimed at making fortunes. Those people who moved to the southern states, places like Georgia and Carolina and Virginia and Alabama, Arkansas, they were going there to set up plantations. The climate and the geography of those areas make them absolutely ideal for the production of highly lucrative cash crops, things like cotton, tobacco, sugar, things that can be mass produced, grown on huge estates, and then sold for a massive profit, largely in Europe. Now, those things are very desirable. It makes great business sense to go and set up a plantation. What you do need, though, is a lot of manpower. You need to have a workforce that are prepared to work very long hours in very hot climate and to work very painful, boring, laborious, hard tasks. Picking cotton is tough work. Working on a sugar plantation is very physically demanding. They did experiment with paying workers to do it and found it didn't work. People were not prepared to put in those kind of hours, in that kind of condition, for the type of pay that they were going to get. They also found that many Europeans didn't have the immune system and the physiology to actually survive there. They found it too hot, they didn't have resistance to the types of insects that were very common in the south. An obvious answer for white people, white businessmen in the 16th, the 17th, 18th centuries was to use black slaves. Racism was widespread. Most people believed that blacks were physically and intellectually inferior. Religious groups preached that the blacks were inferior. They were godless heathens and savages. So it made a lot of sense to white Europeans to enslave black people and to use them in areas like plantations where they actually seem to be physically suited to the task. So what you get in America is some originally colonies and then states getting heavily into slavery. These are the ones in the south. We're talking about North and South Carolina, we're talking about Alabama, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, I'm forgetting all of them now, there are so many, Virginia, South Carolina, and so on. Now, because these are a slave economy, they were heavily into bringing in large numbers of slaves. In the north, they didn't need slaves. They haven't got the climate or the geography to grow the cash crops like sugar and cotton. They're working in coal mining, they're working in other types of farming. They never needed slaves, so they never had slaves. So in those areas, their relationship with black people and the relationship between black and white people was always different. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the abolitionist movement grows strongly in popularity. It was originally in England, but then grew very, very strongly in America, with a number of people putting forward the moral arguments against slavery. That it is cruel, that it is unfair, that it is anti-Christian, that it is backwards. And those arguments became increasingly popular. As America grew as a country, as more areas, more territories wanted to become states, then each time a territory applied for the right to become a state, this argument rose again. Would this state be a slave state or a free state? In many cases, they allowed the territory itself to decide, and in some cases it was a moot point. If they were in the far north, they didn't want slaves, so they became free states. If they were further south, then they would tend to become slave states. Texas, for example, when it joined the Union, joined as a slave state, but Texas is in the south. In some cases, Missouri being the obvious example, when that joined in the 1840s, they had what was called the Missouri Compromise. So half of Missouri had slaves and half didn't. It was a bizarre situation, and a situation that couldn't continue. It was always going to come to a head, and it comes to its head most dramatically in 1861. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States of America. Lincoln had campaigned on an abolitionist standpoint. He had always said that as president he would abolish slavery. For the states in the South, this was a crucial point. It was a point at which they couldn't accept Lincoln as president, and so they declared independence from the United States. They set up what was called the Confederacy, and the American Civil War began. So this is a war which, on one level, is about slavery. It's about whether we have slaves in America or we don't. It's also a war about the rights of states. Who is more important, the president and the federal structure, or each individual state? And for the many states in the Confederacy, they were saying, this isn't about slavery at all. This is about our right to choose what rules and laws we want in our state. Crucially, the South lost. It took 4 years. It was a very bitter and painful war, but at the end of it, the North won. Slavery was abolished. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution was passed, which banned slavery throughout the country. And now you have 5.5 million black people who overnight became free. And that presented huge problems, not only for them, but also for white people living with them. You have 5.5 million people who have no money, who have no possessions, who have no belongings of their own, who have come from split families, who have had their own families split up, who have no education. And many slave owners thought it was dangerous to teach slaves to read and write, so most of them are illiterate. They also have no skill apart from growing cotton. They're used to being slaves. And there are also people who, from their birth, and that's the important thing to remember, that 80% of slaves freed in 1865 were born in America. They didn't come from Africa, they didn't come from anywhere else, they're American. And so they've only known slavery. So every day of their life, a white man has told them what to do. It means they've never, in many cases, developed decision-making skills of their own. It means they're very lost when the Civil War ends. And for some, this is a fantastic opportunity. If you're a young man, you'll move. You'll go north, you'll go west, you'll go somewhere else. If, however, you're older, if, however, you're female with children, if you are less outgoing and ambitious, you're probably going to stay in the South. If you're white and in the South, again, this is a whole new world and a whole new situation, and one that will be causing you great anxiety and some sense of fear too. The anxiety comes from the fact that you still want to make money. cotton is still going to be popular. People are still going to want to put sugar in their tea. These are still going to be very, very valuable cash crops, and as soon as possible the South's going to get back to work. Now, they can't do it with slaves. What they will do is they will end up employing most of their old slaves as workers. They'll pay them, but they don't have to now feed them or home them. So most of them who do stay, most of the freed slaves who stay in the South, will carry on working exactly where they've worked all their lives, doing the same thing they've always done, but now they're getting paid for it. The other thing that's really going to cause fear through most of the white population is now a sense of losing control. There was certainly a fear that the blacks would run rampage and would want revenge on the whites for the years of abuse they've suffered. And while this happened in a few rare occasions, by and large it didn't happen. By and large, most freed slaves just left, or they stayed. And if they stayed, they didn't want to particularly challenge people that would now be employers. What you do see, though, is the white communities working very quickly to re-establish their own level of control and superiority. So you see them introducing laws which will keep the blacks in a subservient role. They introduced laws which will restrict the ability of blacks to vote. They'll introduce literacy tests, they'll introduce property qualification requirements that will make it impossible for black people to have the right to vote. And once you don't have the right to vote, you have very little say and influence. From the 1866-67 onwards, you're seeing most of these states introducing what became known as the Jim Crow laws. Laws which legally segregated and separated black people from white. This would mean they would go to all black schools, there would be black areas of towns in which people could live, and it was aimed at keeping them separate. Now, these are things that build up over time. They don't happen overnight, but over a 20-30 year period, it becomes the normal situation that black people are subservient. Many will leave, many will go north, many will go somewhere else. But for those who stay, this becomes life. This becomes part of what you do. This is what happens in the South. Remember as well, this is the late 19th century. Communication is nowhere near the level it is today. There aren't newspapers, there aren't televisions, there aren't huge photographic institutions and things that could get images and messages and ideas around. So most people, if you're not in the South, will be unaware of what's going on there. And if you're in the South, you'll be unaware of what life's like anywhere else. Elsewhere, you will still see racism. You will still see racism and segregation in the North. It's just not legal, though. You won't see signs saying whites only or blacks only in the North. But you'll see places where black people are not welcome. You'll see places where everybody who lives there is white. So it is a very meek situation. That's the background. Please go and look in the textbook. Look at the first chapter of the textbook, because that does go over this whole situation in more detail and help you pick up on all the bits where I've got it wrong or I've just skated over bits too quickly. But hopefully this has given you an insight into what was happening in America before the 20th century. Thank you very much.